Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Life by Design podcast. On this week's episode, we talk with one of my favorite human beings, Mark Groves. Mark Groves is a human connection specialist, the creator of the very popular Create the Love, and also the host of the Mark Groves podcast. In this week's episode, we talk about betrayal, regulating your nervous system, belonging and the challenges over the last 3 years, integrity, the ultimate partnership with your partner, and much, much more. Enjoy the episode. Mr. Mark Groves, welcome to the podcast.
Oh man, I'm so excited to finally be here.
6 months in the making, my friend. I reached out to your team. They said he is in it, and you were in it with the newborn and plenty going on. So there's a lot for us to talk about when it comes to dad life and a lot more. Before we get started, can you give the guys a 60 to 90 second spiel of who you are and what has got you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I am obsessed with understanding how humans connect, how we relate. It was birthed from an obsession of understanding how to manipulate behavior as a salesperson. I was in the pharmaceutical industry for 14 years, which I think I'm undoing the karmic debt of that. But I was obsessed with how to manipulate human behavior. I was also from the setting of like, how do I influence women so that they like me and, I can hook up with them when I was younger and operating from my wounds. And then it became an obsession with really wanting to understand romantic relationships because I realized I was abysmal at them and I thought I was good at them. That was the problem. And then I got to a relational ending. And being that I had a background in pharma, I was really interested in understanding the science of relationships, the research. And so I dove deep into that and went back to school, studied positive psychology, and really focused on teaching what I was learning about myself, about what I'd been doing, why I was doing it, and in a way, sort of using expression as a way to excise my pain and my shame. And that started to do really well. And I left the pharma industry and went into teaching, podcasting, conferences, speaking, all that kind of stuff. And here I am.
I actually know that part about the pharmaceutical element, which is very interesting based on the last few years. Hopefully we'll get time for that. What changed for you when you started shifting from understanding humans for manipulation purpose to understanding humans from a very clean, maybe unwounded place? Like what shifted for you in that changing of the guard?
Yeah, when I was younger, like pre-19 years old, I thought I was really good at love. I thought I was great at relationships. I loved love. That was a joke my brother often said about me. My nickname as a kid was Sensitor from my brother, which was meant to be shaming. We're still great friends and close, but it was meant to be shaming. And in a way, I felt shame when I got called that. And he would say, you love love. And I did love love. But of course I'd be like, no, I don't. But I did. And when I was 19, my first relationship ended with a betrayal from my partner. My second relationship at 19 ended with a betrayal from my partner. And the way that I dealt with that was not healthy. It was, finding the bottom of a pint glass. I had not been taught how to explore grief and betrayal and rage. I didn't know how to express anger. So I just internalized everything, expressed it in sports. And it wasn't until years later, probably about 8 years, that I found myself at the end of an engagement that I didn't want to be in with a really fantastic woman. I didn't know why I didn't want to be in it. And the shift that happened at 19 is I really started, instead of like investing in love and relationship, I was really afraid of monogamy. I had this underlying unconscious belief that when I let people love me, they're going to betray me. And so unconsciously, I was controlling intimacy through short-term connections. I was running from women who really cared about me, who could choose me. I didn't know why. At the end of the day, a woman would say something like, I really care about you. I like you. And I saw the goodness in them. I saw the possibility in them, but I would get sick in my stomach and I would shut down. I'd ghost, I'd disappear, I'd run, I'd become avoidant. And when I was engaged, that woman I dated for 5 years, and now I look back, I just couldn't stay. I just couldn't be with her. The possibility of creating a future, I didn't even know how to receive love anymore because unconsciously in my mind, love led to extreme pain and I hadn't explored the pain. So because the pain was unexplored, it was being avoided. And that shift occurred when I got to the end of the engagement and I ended it, and I thought to myself, like, how did I get here? Like, I feel like I've been on autopilot. How did I get to a place where I got engaged that I didn't want to? That makes no sense. Like, I spent all this money for what? And then I witnessed that when I left the engagement, the opinion that people had of me often was that I was afraid of commitment. I was the problem. And I saw that there was this narrative that if your relationship ends, there's something wrong with you. And so I desperately wanted to understand, why culturally do we run from endings? You know, we don't watch them navigated with grace. We shame people who get divorced. At first, my sort of intention was to normalize that relational endings can be loving, that they can be actually, the choice itself can be the loving thing to do, the right thing to do. And staying for any and all reasons is not healthy all the time. So I wanted to bring some light to that and some healing to that. And then it really just led to this incredible deep dive into every complexity of the human experience. And so that shift really sort of was layered, but I'd say the first time I really turned around and oriented back to looking at 19-year-old me and the betrayals was when I was 27. And it was due to the ending of the relationship and not knowing what I was doing, but it was also because I read the book Man's Search for Meaning. And I'd never thought, like, maybe my life is about more than just being a provider, making a certain amount of money, buy a house, take care of a family. And maybe I actually have a soul's purpose here. And I'd been so disconnected from spirituality because I grew up Catholic. And so I rejected anything that wasn't linear and scientific. I rejected the word God. I mean, gosh, I only really became comfortable even sitting with that word about 4 years ago. So, yeah.
That kind of moment is a really good catalyst for change. It can be really hard to get to that moment. And often blokes in particular need to experience some real levels of pain. But also, it can also be quite challenging because you don't know where to turn. Like, okay, things aren't working for me. I'm lost, you know, whatever it might be. Where did you start when you had that realization? Like, where's the first point of call? Who's the first person you speak to? What's the first what's that initiation for you as you start to look at things differently?
Well, you know, when I was younger, I hadn't seen like deep grief. I think I was ashamed about the betrayal. Like, you know, it was a second betrayal that I'd experienced, that someone cheated on me. And so I was ashamed. I know people who hide that they've been betrayed. They never tell because they're embarrassed, because we make it mean something about our value, which is really fascinating. And so when I look back at 19-year-old me, I had never seen grief excavated in a mature, healthy initiation, right? To have I never brought it to my dad. I never brought it to my mom. And I don't know why. You know, my father and mother, especially my father, is really safe emotionally. I had friends who really witnessed it. That was a big deal. And, you know, in my later life, when I went through a breakup in my 30s, I knew how to reach out to people and say, I really need you right now. Or I need a tether to the world. Like, I remember when Kylie and I broke up, which we now, because we've been back together and now we have a kid, but when we broke up, we call it the sacred pause now. And I remember when we broke up, I went to the woods, which going to a cabin in the woods by yourself right after a breakup, I'm not really sure that's the optimal mental health choice. But I was there, and I remember my friend calling me and being like, how are you? And I was like, I'm not okay. And he's like, do you want me to come to the cabin? And I was like, yeah. And he drove to the cabin. It was like 3-4 hours for him. And he just sat there with me. And I think about like how when you're in that sort of darkness, you need someone that says like, I'm not going to let you slip away, but I'm also not going to rob you from the value of it. And that's why when I see people going through relational endings, you know, I think what we do is we try to save people from feelings we don't know the value of. And that grief, I know grief is one of the greatest catalysts for transformation. I think as men, you know, think about it. Our emotionality is actually equated to weakness. And as much as we like to think, well, I can still sort of navigate it, but on a deep unconscious level, and it can be conscious, but I would say ultimately it's usually unconscious first, is that to dive into your emotionality and accept your emotionality it means to actually reject the definition of masculinity that you've been culturally taught. So in order to step into the fullness of your expression, you have to actually at the same time, paradoxically, let the definition, quote unquote, of masculinity die. So you have a mortality that's occurring, and then you have to grieve what that's done from the perspective of the prison it has kept you in. Because, when men are truly embracing of all their feelings, they're incredibly emotionally intelligent. When they really step into their emotionality, the ability to use language and expression. Think of musicians that are expressing heartbreak. Think of poetry. We have all these incredible male poets. Not to say there aren't great female ones, but I'm saying when we dive deep into our emotionality, watch out in a good way.
Something you said there, heavily underrated, in that we often rob people of their grieving and their own process. For most people, it's well-intended. I'd say just about everyone. And also for a lot of people, they can't hold someone in that space. They make it, with its meaning, or they get uncomfortable when someone else is going through their process. What have you noticed come up for you as you hold space better for clients, for your partner, and I guess even for your newborn now? Like, what have you had to move through yourself so that you can hold a cleaner and safer container for others?
Such a good question. And I think the true self-reflection when you try to save people from feelings, which is ultimately codependent, is that we have to explore the capacity of our nervous system for different emotional dysregulation. So, the other day I was having a conversation with someone and they were incredibly dysregulated. And it was about gender, and it was just about the nuances of the conversation, but they were incredibly activated. And I just said to them, hey, like, when you're ready to have this conversation, I am here to have it safely, lovingly, open. And that I have definitely not always been like that. But the last 3 years have really taught me how to be with nuance, how to be with disagreement. And, I know this from a romantic relationship level, but I think culturally what we're being really challenged with is that the depth of intimacy that you can hold in a romantic relationship will be limited by your ability to be with difference and recognize that intimacy and trust comes from the ability to hold difference, and recognize that there is a deeper level of wisdom that's available when two truths become one. And what I mean by that is that my partner is wise about her experience of what she's going through. Mine has value too, but between those and combined from those is actually a deeper wisdom. And we're not being modeled that collectively in culture either, because you look at, if something is considered an opposing view, it's considered against that thing. And so for us to be able to hold the complexity of emotional difference or even someone else's activation is when we make it about ourselves. If I'm afraid that you're upset and that means it's going to threaten our connection, which means it's going to threaten my safety, which means I'm not going to be liked, I'm not going to belong. The depth of your relationships will always be determined by your ability to be disliked or your position to not be agreed with. And God, isn't that the work for all of us? I think the internet is the ultimate personal growth vehicle for that. If our romantic relationships weren't, the comment section of a Instagram reel will certainly challenge every aspect of our wounding.
Talking of being agreeable, non-agreeable, standing your truth, and potentially the last 3 years, what have you learned about humans, or what have been your biggest takeaways over the last 3 years as you explore humans?
It's given me a lot of context to, I didn't really understand previously how things like World War II in Germany happen, from a psychological perspective. And I remember in Sam Harris's book, Free Will, he basically makes the assertion that everybody, if they traded, let's say, a Nazi soldier position, cell for cell, experience for experience, they all would become the same. And I always remember that statement from the perspective of like, our idea of free will is just a projection onto another person of our current awareness. So it's like when we look at someone who lives on the street, we say, just get a job, or we see a heroin addict, we're like, just quit heroin. But we'd all be in the exact same circumstances if we traded. And so one thing that it has taught me is that now I understand how fear, when amped up, when really amplified, and then someone's given a solution to that fear, how much we will bulldoze, censor, destroy, hurt, anything that gets in the way of the proposed solution. And how easily things like, what's interesting when people hear me say stuff like this is they're often this idea that I'm pro or against. I like the complexity of this, which is that when you look at public health and politicians, and what has happened in the last 3 years is they really moralized a position. And they did that through language, which was intentional. That's what public health does. They use what are called nudge tactics. And, it's in order, do the right thing, do it for each other, have each other's back. So if you say do the right thing, you infer that there's a wrong thing and it's not the thing they're asking you to choose. And then anyone who doesn't do that thing is now not for collectivism, is not for helping other people, is selfish, is right wing, and so you have all these ideological bubbles that someone's put in the moment they question something. And you can kind of insert any main ideological narrative now into that. If you question it, I was talking to a friend the other day and I was questioning something and they said, that's a very right wing perspective. And I was like, actually, it has nothing to do with politics. That's a false dichotomy. But what it does is it instantly puts someone in a box. So I hadn't explored the depth of this. Now I read things like The Madness of Crowds or the book Propaganda, which is really fascinating. I've interviewed experts on propaganda, psychology, and psychology of groups. And now I get it. Like now I'm like, oh, wow, we are so easily influenced and manipulated when we're afraid. And especially when our belonging is threatened. We're willing to get rid of our friends. We're willing to get rid of our family. We're willing to do anything to be perceived as good, even if presented with the information that doesn't make that choice make logical sense anymore. The moment they said, and I'm sure this for all of you listening, let's enter right into the landmines, but it's like the moment they said that the vaccine, that we knew it didn't stop transmission, which it was never actually tested to do. So as a former rep, I knew that you can't actually make a claim about a product unless you have a study that proves that it does that. It's illegal to make claims for products that they don't have an indication for, which is the language for the legal approval, at least in Canada and the US. And when they said it stops transmission, I had read the clinical trials. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. They didn't show that in the trials. They can't say that. And then when it became public knowledge that it didn't, and then mandates came out. Well, the mandates only kind of made sense if we're just throwing out everything we know about human rights and history. But if we're just throwing that out, we're just going with, okay, we're in a new era and we're going to get everyone to get this thing because it's for everybody and it stops transmission. It didn't. And so here I saw these people continue to support something that didn't logically make sense. And that's why I just kept observing, being like, wow, like we are so captured by the fear of this that I can show you absolute information that disproves the logic of that choice, and you'll still attack, you'll still support it. So man, that's a long answer to your question, but that has been so fascinating to me and scary, to be honest, because I was in Canada. So that tells you, you're in Australia, so you know what I'm talking about.
So you and I have obviously been on a similar page in terms of questioning the main narrative. What challenges has that brought about for you over the last 3 years as an extension of what you just kind of said?
Well, you know, how I approached the world didn't change. Like when I started to question the Institute of Relationships and what I'd been taught growing up or lack thereof, I also was a pharmaceutical rep. So when I was in that industry, I started to wake up in that industry when I learned about the history of cholesterol and fat and the cause of diabetes and insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease. And for anyone listening who's curious about that, dive deep into it because it will blow your mind. And that made me be like, oh, wow, if they lied about that. I mean, this is like 10 years ago that I was thinking that. So I've always questioned things and I was reading the clinical trials. So for me, I wasn't doing anything I hadn't normally done. I was still asking questions out loud. I was still publicly having dialogues, but all of a sudden what was allowed to be talked about changed. And then also as they sort of enrolled an army of people to attack anyone who is dissenting, I experienced that. I mean, my business got decimated on, so many levels. I got shadow banned, I got all the things. And I never once put up some sort of misleading, false, all the things that are true today that we know are true are things that I said when they were known they were true because they were based on original data. I mean, I'm documented on my podcast saying that the lockdowns will cause more harm than good. They're not supported by science. I don't understand this. So, I mean, the cost has been immense in a lot of ways. Psychologically, it was really hard. I mean, there were some dark times there for sure when the people you love most are calling you names, are taking distance from you, or talking behind your back. Your family feels a bit divided. I'm watching the news say, don't invite this person to Thanksgiving or Christmas, even though that didn't make sense. Like we should have just, if we're following quote unquote the science, we should say everybody get a test, no matter your vaccine status. I mean, I was shocked that someone would think they're safer beside a vaccinated person who's never had COVID than a person who's had COVID. That person who's had COVID and has recovered is much safer to be beside. Again, it wasn't logical, and that was really hard to witness. I mean, it creates sadness to me today to think about how much harm to relationships that was caused by that. But on a really beautiful note, it taught me that if push comes to shove and I have to choose integrity versus money, status, success, I'll choose integrity all day. And I think to be faced with that type of choice and be ready to be sort of crucified is tough. And I don't ever want it to lead to righteousness, because it can easily lead to that kind of path of like, well, look, see, I stood up to this. No, I have so much sadness for how much we've been divided. And I want to be part of the solution, of the bridge to building that back, which is by modeling dialogues between opposing views. So the cost was big. The psychological cost was huge. However, it has made it so I've had to learn how to have hard conversations that, as I was saying earlier, are triggering, are inflamed, are all those things. Because if you and I don't have them, who is going to? Everyone is so terrified of getting canceled. Everyone is so terrified of being seen as anti-vaccine, transphobic, anti-climate, like insert the name conspiracy theorist, you know? And now I'm like, if we do some sort of score on conspiracies versus not, it's looking good for the conspiracies, you know? And that we shouldn't even be proud of that, because we like enrolled people to attack anything that we could just call a conspiracy and then dismiss it, dismiss the person, call them right wing. And now I feel politically homeless because, you know, I'm like, well, I used to be kind of on the left, and now I'm like, well, I'm definitely not on the far right. So does anybody want to start a new party in the middle? I don't know.
Mate, we're on the same page. So if it's a party for one and you start it, I'll be your second.
It's an international party. We'll be like the World Economic Forum, but the World Freedom Forum. Let's call it that. That sounds good. You can't use the word freedom anymore. That's right wing.
That's wrong. So we'll have to come up with another name, but I think we'll have a few.
I don't know. Liberation? That doesn't sound, that's not as activating. How's the impact been on you? I'm curious, on your business, on you.
Massive, massive. And very similar to you. If I had my time again, I would have stayed in my heart more in the, And first and foremost, I could have done it so much with so much more grace and humility than I did. But when the attack started on me and I felt like the minority, I felt ostracized, demonized, outed, similar to kind of some of the feelings that you had, I was ready to go to war. And it really brought up for me childhood stuff of being outed, ostracized, demonized. So everything that had been unprocessed came up. And it was like, I experienced rage. Like I've never been more activated in my shadow elements than I was in that 3-year period. And I really resonate with the way that and I'm interested because I want to kind of throw this back on you a little bit with this exact topic, because as someone who has such a kind, clean, heart-based energy, I really have felt a stronger, I guess, connection to you, albeit through social media, in seeing that other side of you, in seeing the side that like has got like serious spine and had to stand up in the hard conversations. And I wonder, you know, yes, there's probably, if it's anything like me, people that have peeled away because of our choices, but I've felt a deeper, you know, as ironic as it is, I felt a deeper connection to you in seeing the way that you've stood up over the last 3 years. Is that a message that others have come forward with you?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And what you said earlier actually resonated because the way I handled it at first was not filled with grace because I was enraged. I was being dehumanized and it wasn't based on facts. It wasn't based on science, but all these words were being thrown around as if it was just absolute and no question. And I was like, oh my God, there's so much question, but you're shaming me for questioning. But my wife said to me, no one's going to listen to you if you're dysregulated. She was like, the people who will listen to you are the people who are dysregulated and they're just going to get more enraged. And I was like, that's so true because if I recorded a video and I was mad, it got a lot of traction, but it didn't get traction from the people I necessarily wanted traction with. And so I've really practiced being regulated in my delivery because I know that that's one of the bridges forward, at least the one I can see. Yeah, I definitely have heard that. I mean, it's made me stand in my integrity and my values more than ever. It's made me access a part of the masculine that I think I didn't necessarily have access to.
What's that part? I think I know what you're talking about, but I'd love for you to go into that part.
I think it's a knowing that like, if I had to go to war for the proper principles, I would die for this, for the subject of openness, of curiosity, of standing for what's right. Like, I'm not going to watch it. I've never allowed a group of people to be dehumanized, and I wasn't about to let it be me. But to be able to see that, it sort of gave myself probably gave a deeper trust for my partner. I'd be curious to ask her, but it gave me a deeper sense of trust in preparation for fatherhood, to say like, now I look at my son and now there's a different position that I'm in, which I now am looking at the world from the place of I'm not always going to be here, but he's going to be here. And when he's here, what are we going to stand for? What's he going to see as his father? Like what mattered for his father, for his mother, and I think that accessing that level of protection, which is an important part of the masculine, which, there's lots of theories that we want to demasculinize the population because then we make us more malleable. And, where I didn't maybe necessarily agree with that. And I don't think there's some sort of coordinated thing for that. And some people might believe there is. We have the massive endocrine disruptors in our food in plastic bottles, and you look at the fertility of men is going way down. Testosterone levels are going down. There's a bunch of studies on that. I think for me, it's been that access to this like deeply rooted knowing that like, hey, if it matters, I'm here for it. So I really resonate with what you're saying. And I think, actually, to just kind of put a button in that is I think it's sacred rage. Like rage, there's rage that's destructive and there's rage that's constructive. Although this could just be my myopic view of myself and I'm open to that idea, I think it's sacred rage because sacred rage is so important in relationship. It's what draws boundaries.
Can you just explain that briefly for those that don't understand that term? Because I completely see that. And I, as an observer of your work, would agree. But again, I don't see the ins and the outs, but I can see that in you. But can you explain that terminology for someone who might be new to that?
Yeah. So when we look at the emotion of anger, there's a thought, depending on whose work you read or where you come from, that anger is a secondary emotion. There's another saying that anger is sad's bodyguard. When sadness is not available for self-expression, it usually expresses as anger, and that's usually men. Anger that we're afraid of is aggression. Anger that is healthy and clean is constructive. So when we're not safe to be in our anger, it's usually because we experienced anger that was destructive. We experienced anger that was painful, that hurt people, that hurt us maybe. And so when we can actually get into the space, we really have to explore our own anger. And I like doing this, I think in men's work is really powerful, doing it in groups where you're in this container where the men got you. They're not going to let you go too far, but they're also going to have you go to the edge of your rage. Boxing is really good for this, kickboxing, where you're working on a bag and you're able to get to the edge of exasperation of your rage. And what that does is it allows you to know the whole range of your emotion so that you can be in what I'm saying is clean anger. So rage, when we're at that like end, that's protective, that when we know how to be in it is sacred. It's like when you see things like the women's marches or the Me Too movement, those are sacred rage. They're rage that is about no more. And we talked about like, sometimes it takes forever for men to get to a place of change. And that's usually because we're so used to bypassing our emotions and our intuition so much that when we have to get to a place where it is no more, where we can't take anymore. But really, you don't have to wait till you get there. You just got to follow the feeling that you don't want to do something anymore. But it usually takes hitting the dead end before we figure that one out.
One of the things you mentioned there, and I know you haven't spoken to your partner about it, but you think that she might have developed a deeper level of trust based off the last 3 years. What's at the core of that? And what exactly do you mean by that? What changed for you as you had to stand in your truth that would ignite a deeper level of trust within the relationship?
Yeah, there's a saying from Robert Glover in his book, No More Mr. Nice Guy, where he says, if you don't stand up to her, she won't believe you'll stand up for her. And, I think my sense is that because there was a witnessing of me standing in my values, and we have talked about this, so there has been some expression of this, where she said, like, I really acknowledge you for being willing to go into the crossfire. Like, I acknowledge you. I see how hard this is. I see what you're going through, and I'm here for you, and I support everything you're doing. I mean, that's, knowing someone has your back in that sense makes you stronger. And I think because on a nervous system,
just on that, like, those were like, I got goosebumps, I got chills, like, and I'm starting to get emotional, but I'd be interested because this is obviously your area of expertise. That quote and that partnership, and I've got your back, and like, fuck, I don't know if it gets more empowering than that for a bloke, like,
no, right?
Doesn't get any better.
Yeah, because like when the world you're facing psychologically, you're facing the idea of total decimation of your belonging. I mean, that's what's happened. To stand up and say this isn't okay, vaccine passports aren't okay, whatever it is that's mattering to us, that when you're going against a mainstream narrative, that the cost of it is goodbye. Like, you're not going to be allowed to eat. The politicians are all calling you shit, and that in Australia was rampant. And the way the language that your politicians used was honestly disgusting and dehumanizing. Canada too. Now, Justin Trudeau ain't getting any awards, but that deep knowing that we're good, that was everything for me. And, I'll often check in with her. Like, am I crazy? Like, am I crazy that I'm seeing it this way? She's like, no, you're not. And that you were asking, like, what is that part of deeper sense of trust? And I do think it is that she can trust me to stand up for me. Like, when it comes to principles, I'm there and I'm not going to bend. And that means that between us, she's going to know that my no is a real no and my yes is a real yes.
What's the before and after for you guys? Because you split for a short period of time. What had to change in that time apart for you guys to come back together stronger and now obviously create a family together?
Well, the previous version of the relationship, I was wanting to create a family. We'd been together 5-ish years, something like that. And very early on in our relationship, I'd said, this is, the time I want to have kids. This is what I'm looking for. Are you looking for that? Yes, I am. Same timeline? Perfect. And then the timeline changed. She came to me, hey, I actually don't want to do it in that time. Can we actually do it in this time? I was like, okay. Yeah, that feels okay for me. And under that was also this, like, her expressing that she's not sure she could choose the relationship fully. Like, there was just something getting in the way. And I was like, okay, well, she'll figure it out, right? Like, there's something getting in the way, but like, we're in this, we're working through this. She'll figure it out. I'll figure it out, whatever. But then when she went to change that deal breaker again, the kid thing, I was like, you've changed this deal breaker too many times. Like, what's going on here? Like, we can't keep extending this deadline because, one, I'm getting older, and two, like, there's something below this maneuvering of the deal breaker that we're not confronting. And so, it came to a place where I was like, look, this is the life I want to create. This is how I want to create it. I want to create it with you. If you don't want to create it with me, that's okay. I love you, but I cannot continue if that's true. And, we went to couples therapy, we went to coaching, we did a bunch of things, and she just couldn't figure out what was in the way. And so when it came to a place where I was like, all right, we got to end this. And she was like, yeah, we do. It was like we just didn't have another choice. And it was beautiful because I was talking earlier about my engagement ending when I was young and not knowing how to close something with love. And so we had this opportunity. We did a closing ceremony and we blessed the relationship and one another in its ending. And you don't realize how powerful that is in the moment. But I really think in a lot of ways, one that taught us that love can still transcend relational statuses, that we still loved one another. We just changed the container of our relationship, changed the definition of it, changed. And that modeled it for a lot of people who had been following our work and my work and her work individually too. And because I shared it all out loud, I did a podcast episode called Adulting is Hard. And that is me talking about our closing ceremony, which I've never listened to it again because there was a lot of good sobs in that one. But yeah, what changed was the first relationship was operating from our wounding. One, no one ever chooses me fully. No, I mean, it was perfect. It was fucking perfectly designed. And then I finally chose myself in the ending. Hers was that what's wrong with me that I can't choose this, like I'm broken. There's something wrong with me in relationship. And then by her choosing to end the relationship too, she chose herself. And so there was an element of self-trust that was created in the ending. And also that there wasn't this prison that if you leave me, I'm broken. Now it was, oh, if you're not more complete, if you're not more alive through this connection, then there's something wrong with it. Like this relationship should be liberating, not an imprisonment. In so many relationships, I think of the language of vows, like till death do us part. And I often think about the language of that. Like, do we mean a mortal death or the death of the person that chose the relationship at the time? And we often avoid hard conversations because we're afraid of relationships ending, not realizing that the hard conversations are actually what deepen relationships. So because the cost of relationships ending are so big on us socially and culturally and how we're perceived and how society sees us, how religion categorizes that, divorce versus not, because there's so much on the line, we do everything we can to stay together and not deepen the relationship. And so for us, there was just this radical experience of more love when we closed it. And then the relationship was over. It was over for sure. I was not thinking about getting back together. I had no interest. I still loved her, respected her, but I did not want to spend any more time trying to get someone to choose me. I was done. She was done trying to force that. And so when we came back together, we were both free. We were both not seeking relationship from a wounded place. And we dated for 3 months just to make sure that the relationship was actually for us. We're like, do we actually want this? Are we a good fit? Can we create something from this? And the answer was yes. And now we have a son. So that's pretty good.
Till death do us part. I was out with some friends on Saturday night and having a conversation around this exact piece. How does that sit with you as a vow, as a commitment? How does that thought sit with you?
Yeah, there's this quote that Aubrey Marcus shared with me, and it's from Jordan Peterson, which I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of opinions about Jordan Peterson. But this quote is great. And it is, commitment only works when you do it. And I thought about that. Like, what does it mean to be truly committed to love? Well, most of us, when we enter a relationship and we say, I'm committed to you, I'm committed to love, but then we have open sexual energy with other people. We have unclosed relationships from our past. We're not telling our partners the truth. We're not learning how to be better communicators. We're still operating from our wounds. We get defensive. We shut down. We're not actually committed to the relationship, because if we were committed to the relationship, we'd be committed to the gifts that the relationship is bringing forward to us that we need to heal. Relationships offer the most potent container for transformation, because everything you're not good at will get magnified. And that could be because love's on the line, and it could be because we're afraid of abandonment, betrayal, rejection, all those things. But I even think now, like my partner and I were both tired. We're new parents. And I was thinking the other day, because, I can feel reactivity in me. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm in like the deepest opportunity right now for more change. I didn't think that at the time when I was activated, but after I was like, I can't, I think of Francis Weller has this great line where he says like, don't waste a good divorce. Don't waste a good diagnosis. Like there's a chance to build something really beautiful from that. So I think that vow is often bullshit because it's usually just a repeated vow. Like we didn't even write it ourselves. And, I think that our commitment to relationships is often superficial. Recently I was just reading a passage from Tokapa Turner, who wrote a book called Belonging. And she wrote, it's so, I love how serendipitous it is when you talk about something. And it says, at the very heart of belonging is the word long. To belong to something is to stay with it for the long haul. It's an active choice we make to a relationship, to a place, to our body, to a life, because we value it. Even knowing that it may not be all that we hope it to be, we are keeping the long view of what is possible, and our life becomes an offering to make it so. And I think there's a line, of course, because, there's people who invest in relationships that are not actually worthy of investment. And I think that's the lesson of those relationships. But I think there's these relationships where two really good people actually have a desire to create something more, and they're willing to do it with one another. And I think if we're willing to stay in the fire just a little longer, we come out on the other side in a state that we didn't know was possible. And, like if you have friction in a relationship and the relationship is lasting 20 years, friction for 4 months doesn't seem like a big deal. But if you are only in it for the moment, then a 1 month or 2 month or 3 month friction is actually detrimental or devastating.
So I'll propose another question. Let's say that you fully committed to the relationship, which I would tend to agree that I think people pull the pin too easily and often without the tools. And you're, brilliant shining light for new tools and new ways of communicating for many of those people in relationships. And what if that wasn't someone's truth anymore? Like deep, deep truth. So you're committed to the relationship or your commitment to your deepest truth. Let me throw that one in there and see how you operate that.
Well, first I'd say that if someone's deepest truth is that the relationship is not for them, they can't pretend that's not true. I would say that's abandoning one's own knowing. And I would also argue, was the relationship actually started from a deeper knowing that it wasn't the relationship for you? But either way, when someone asks me something like, should I stay or go? There's so many complexities to that, because we need to look at what does it mean for us if a relationship ends? Is it abandoning ourselves to stay or to leave? And, do we know there's deeper work there, but we're afraid of it? Are we afraid of having to repair and explore shame that we have? But I also would say that there's no wrong decision, because I know someone who's currently in a relationship who is terrified to leave, but wants to leave, and has been exploring every possible circumstance, anything but it to be that they need to leave. And I said to this person, if you leave, you will only be informed. You will only learn. You only learn that feeling you had was fear or not, or it was everything. And I think we spend a lot of our time seeking for the answer to be anything but what we know. Because I'm certainly not arguing for everyone to stay in every relationship forever. Because just as much as people leave too early, people stay way too fucking long too. People who totally dislike each other and are just together because the story sounds good. I know so many people like that, where when their partner finally passes, that's their liberation. Or, they're in a relationship because they're afraid that their partner wouldn't be okay without them. And so they stay trapped in this prison. So, I think if someone's deepest truth is a feeling to go, they've got to honor what is true for them, because otherwise they'll resent their partner for having to stay, because they'll blame their partner for staying, even though it's them who's choosing it. And that'll get in the way of the connection anyways.
My friend, there's a lot of thoughts in that. And I'd love to talk to you for hours on end. So hopefully I can get you back on at some stage. Mate, for those that want to find out about you, the work that you do, where's the best spot for them to track you down?
You can find my podcast at Mark Groves Podcast, anywhere you listen to them. My courses are all at createthelove.com, and I've got ones on navigating breakups, becoming your best self, called Rediscover Your Wholeness. I got another one on dating, which is called Dating 101, which is incredible. It explores the nervous system and how your past shows up in relating today. And it's a 4-week course that brings you through that cascade. It makes dating fun and a healing process instead of something that should be daunting. It should be empowering. Those are all there. I have my Instagram, Create the Love, which is about relationships. And then I have It's Mark Groves, which is probably more politically active and related to the subjects of COVID. So, I'm not done exploring all of that yet.
Beautiful. Mate, so good to talk, and appreciate you, the work that you do, and the way that you continue to shine through all your different channels. And thank you for the conversation that we've had today.
Oh man, thanks so much for having me. So grateful.